Imagine a map of the world. Now erase 32 independent states from it. That is precisely the mark left on history by a man who never laid claim to a throne, never wore gold brocade, and in his youth was considered an outsider even among his own people. His name was Subutai, and while great monarchs placed their hopes in divine right, he relied on maps, mathematics, and a terrifyingly precise understanding of human fear. The sound of a hammer striking an anvil in the deep northern forests usually signified the birth of a plow or a knife, but in 1175 it heralded the arrival of one who would shatter the borders of the known world. Subutai was a man of the forest, born to a tribe of blacksmiths who at first did not even know how to sit in a saddle, an unthinkable flaw for a future lord of the steppes. Yet it was this boy from the forge who would win 65 pitched battles, leaving the achievements of Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon combined far behind in the dust. In this episode, we will dissect the mind of the man who transformed nomad fury into a flawless clockwork mechanism of destruction. You will learn how a commoner compelled princes of golden blood to obey him without having any formal right to do so, how he coordinated armies across fronts spanning thousands of kilometers using nothing but smoke, fire, and logic, and why his tactic of deep operations remains a foundational concept in military academies, even in 2025. We will trace the path from his first audacious diversion against the Merkits to the bloodbath at the Kalka River, which made all Europe shudder. You will witness a transformation from a clumsy youth to an old man blind in one eye, who was so heavy he had to be carried in a wagon, and yet this old man in the cart remained the most dangerous creature on the planet. The story of Subutai is not merely a list of victories. It is a chronicle of how pure intellect dismantled the old world. Looking at his calloused palm, once accustomed to a heavy hammer and later gripping the reins of 32 conquered nations, one realizes the fate of empires is decided not by lineage, but by calculation. Prepare to see how the greatest continental empire was forged by the hands of someone who simply knew how to solve the equations of war faster than anyone else. In 1189, the Mongol Empire did not exist on the political map of the world. There were only hundreds of warring clans drowning in endless blood feuds. Into this chaotic time, a teenager arrived at the camp of a young chieftain named Temujin, a boy whose appearance elicited only mockery from the steppe aristocracy. This was the 14-year-old Subutai of the Uriankai tribe, the so-called forest people, who lived by hunting and blacksmithing in the dense taiga. He had no horse, no armor, no noble name. All he brought with him were calluses from a heavy hammer and the advice of his father, who had once supplied coal to Temujin's family. Subutai believed he would become a loyal servant, a simple executor in the shadow of a great man. But the hidden reality was that at that moment, it was not a servant walking into the headquarters of the future Genghis Khan, but the future author of his greatest victories. The hammer that had once obediently forged knife blades in the depths of the forest was now destined to reforge the very map of the Eurasian continent. Soon came the moment of truth, the campaign against the warlike Merkit tribe. While other commanders demanded a frontal assault and a valiant death in combat, young Subutai proposed something extraordinary. He volunteered to go into the enemy camp, posing as a deserter who supposedly hated Temujin and was ready to betray his location. Acting with the skill of a talented performer, he convinced the Merkits that Temujin's army was weak and demoralized. The enemy, blinded by greed and overconfidence, rushed in pursuit, abandoning their fortified positions. They did not suspect that their every step had already been calculated by the forest boy. When the Merkits fell into the trap, the Mongol cavalry, previously concealed by the terrain, crashed down upon them, turning an organized army into a panicked mob. This was the first of Subutai's 65 victories, and it was won without shedding the blood of his comrades unnecessarily, solely through intellect and cunning. Subutai understood what others failed to see. War is not a question of personal courage, but a question of information superiority. In a world where 99% of generals relied on the fury of the charge, he introduced the mathematics of deception. Genghis Khan, observing this, inducted Subutai into his 4 Dogs of War, an elite group of commanders who were authorized to act independently. 14 years old. At this age, modern teenagers are barely choosing a future profession, but Subutai was already commanding detachments that determined the fate of tribes. Genghis Khan abolished the right of blood and introduced the yasa, a law under which talent meant more than pedigree. It was a social ladder that lifted the son of a blacksmith higher than princes and khans. And this elevator was carrying Subutai toward his next, much more massive challenge, where his opponent would not be a nomadic tribe, but an entire world power. Success at the start would have turned anyone else's head, but not Subutai's. He realized that his victory over the Merkits was merely a warm-up before the true storm. On the horizon rose Khwarazmian, a colossus with feet of clay, possessing colossal wealth and an army that outnumbered the Mongols several times over. However, for Subutai, this empire was nothing more than a complex engineering problem that needed to be disassembled part by part. He didn't just need a victory in battle, he required a symbol of the old world's collapse. When Genghis Khan ordered him to pursue Emperor Muhammad II, Subutai turned the war into a personal nightmare for one man. He realized that fear spreads faster than arrows. And so, Subutai began the most massive manhunt in the history of the Middle Ages. 20,000 riders under his command crossed mountains and deserts, not to capture cities, but to chase a single shadow. This decision would mark the beginning of the end for the Islamic Golden Age and force the Emperor of Khwarazmian to die of sheer terror, realizing that it was impossible to hide from the ferocious dog, even at the edge of the earth. In 1219, Khwarazmian stood in the path of Mongol expansion, a colossal Islamic empire whose wealth and military might seemed unshakable. Sultan Muhammad II styled himself the Second Alexander and sincerely believed that behind the high walls of his cities and with the support of a 400,000-strong army, he was completely safe. He was convinced the nomads from the distant steppes would simply crack their skulls against his impregnable citadels. But the hidden reality was that Subutai had already turned this war from a clash of armies into psychological terror. While the Sultan counted on the thickness of his walls, the old general saw before him only a frightened man who needed to be deprived of his footing. Many believed this was a quick chase, but the reality is far more terrifying. Subutai and his comrade Jebe turned the Sultan's life into a 4-year marathon of horror. For 5 months, they breathed down his neck in direct pursuit, and then for another 3 years, they methodically destroyed everything he held dear, until the emperor who ruled millions was reduced to a hunted fugitive. At that time, all of Central Asia had turned into blazing chaos. Trade routes that had connected east and west for centuries were collapsing. In Samarkand and Bukhara, panic grew by the hour as news of the fall of neighboring fortresses reached the palaces. Subutai, leading a corps of 20,000 riders, received a succinct order from Genghis Khan: find and deliver Muhammad II, dead or alive. 20,000 men is the population of a small modern town, but in Subutai's hands, this force became a surgical instrument that sliced through the body of a vast empire. Subutai did not waste time on prolonged sieges. He bypassed cities or issued ultimatums to them, forcing the Sultan to run further and further. Abandoning his harem and treasures, Muhammad II crossed the Amudarya River, knowing that Subutai was following his trail with a speed that defied human imagination. Scouts found the Sultan's abandoned goblets in tents that were still warm, denying the enemy even a single night of safe sleep. Subutai understood. By destroying the leader morally, he would paralyze the entire state machine. This was the first decapitation operation of such magnitude in history. Muhammad II eventually ended up on a tiny, god-forsaken island in the Caspian Sea. There he died in 1221 in utter poverty from an illness caused, according to contemporaries, by black despair. 4 years of pursuit. That is the time it takes a student to get a university degree. In that span, Subutai dismantled an entire region's faith in the invincibility of Islamic monarchies. Khwarazmia fell not because it ran out of soldiers, but because its heart stopped beating. The death of the Sultan put a period at the end of his dynasty's history, but for Subutai, it was merely the end of the introduction. His gaze was already fixed beyond the Caspian Sea, to where, behind the ridge of the Caucasus Mountains, lay lands about which the Mongols knew nothing. The death of the Khwarazmian Shah left Subutai on the shores of the Caspian Sea with an army that thirsted not for rest, but for new horizons. He held a mandate from Genghis Khan to continue reconnaissance, but looming before him was the wall of the Caucasus Mountains, a natural barrier that had protected northern peoples from invasion for centuries. Subutai understood. His forces were small, and any serious alliance of local princes could crush his core in the narrow gorges. He needed not just to pass through the mountains, but to do so in a way that the enemies would clear the path for themselves. He saw that the snow-capped peaks concealed not only dangers, but also the disunity of local rulers. The deficit of information regarding the lands to the north became a challenge to which he responded with a brilliant diplomatic diversion. And then he began his famous raid of 8,000 kilometers, a distance equal to crossing the United States twice. This decision led him to the banks of the Kalka River, where Russian warbands first clashed with an adversary who played with their lives like chess pieces. But before snapping the trap shut on Rus, Subutai had to commit what historians would call the diplomatic betrayal of the century. In 1222, Subutai's corps encountered a barrier created by nature itself to protect civilizations, the snowy peaks of the Caucasus. The local peoples, the Alans and the Cumans, united to trap the uninvited guests in the narrow gorges. His forces were but a handful of sand in the face of the united mountain militia. In a head-on collision, inevitable death awaited him. So he deployed a weapon sharper than any sword, a lie striking directly at the heart of the alliance. He sent envoys to the Cumans with rich gifts and a message: "We are of the same kin as you. Why should you help strangers?" The Cumans, tempted by sudden profit, abandoned their allies right before the battle. The Alans, left in isolation, were crushed, but as soon as the mountains were left behind, Subutai overtook the Cumans themselves and destroyed them, taking back both the gifts and their lives. By 1223, this bloody trail led the Mongols into the southern Russian steppes. Moving against Subutai was a powerful coalition of Rus princes and their new allies, the surviving Cumans. Ancient chronicles estimate this army at 80,000 men, the elite of the princely družinas and hardened steppe cavalry. And although modern historians believe these numbers to be highly inflated, for Subutai it still meant meeting an opponent that outnumbered him several times over. 80,000. It is as if an entire field army were fielded against a single modern division. The princes were confident in their easy victory. They saw before them only an exhausted detachment of nomads that retreated at their every approach. For 9 days, Subutai lured the coalition deep into the steppe, feigning panic. In this pursuit, the Allied regiments stretched out for tens of kilometers, losing contact with one another. When the exhausted warriors reached the banks of the Kalka River, they saw the fleeing Mongols suddenly turn into a flawless battle formation. The strike was lightning fast. Subutai's heavy cavalry sliced through the lines of the princes, and the lack of unified command turned the battle into a slaughter. Subutai won not through strength, but because he warred against the ego of each specific ruler. He knew the princes dreamed of personal glory more than a shared victory. Kalka became the first lesson in history on how discipline can annihilate colossal numerical superiority. This raid of 8,000 kilometers, the distance from Moscow to Vladivostok, became the most massive reconnaissance expedition in history. Subutai was compiling a detailed map. He recorded the quality of roads, water sources, and enemy weaknesses. These records landed on the Khan's table, becoming the foundation for the catastrophe that would crash down upon the world 10 years later. After the triumph at Kalka, Subutai returned to Mongolia not as a hero, but as the keeper of dangerous knowledge. He had seen a world that was much larger and more divided than Genghis Khan had imagined. The death of the great Khan in 1227 temporarily paused the march to the west, but Subutai understood that this was merely the calm before the storm. Temujin's heirs were growing up, and their ambitions demanded new spaces for conquest. However, inside the empire itself, a new, invisible war was ripening. Subutai, being a commoner, now had to lead princes of golden blood into battle, each of whom believed they were born to command. He had wisdom and maps, but they had power and pride. The deficit of authority in the face of capricious Genghisids became a more serious test for the old commander than the Caucasus Mountains. And in 1235, when the Great Western Campaign was announced, Subutai found himself in the most dangerous position of his entire career. He was to become the shadow behind Batu's back, the man who makes all the decisions but gives all the glory to others. This was his most subtle psychological battle: how to force the young lions of the empire to submit to the will of an old dog, to prevent the great campaign from turning into a bloody farce. After the triumph at Kalka, Subutai returned to Mongolia not merely as a hero, but as a custodian of dangerous knowledge. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 temporarily halted the march to the west, but the old commander understood. The steppe had become too narrow for the empire's grown heirs. In 1235, at the Great Kurultai, a decision was made that changed the fate of Eurasia: the march to the last sea. Subutai believed that his experience and gray hair would be law for the princes, but in reality, he found himself in the center of a political storm. Several grandsons of Genghis Khan set out on the campaign at once, including Batu, Guyuk, and Monke. Each considered himself the future master of the world and had no desire to submit to a low-born old man. The fate of the greatest campaign now depended on whether the blacksmith's son could control gods without having the birthright to do so. In those years, all of Mongolia lived in anticipation of unseen plunder. But discipline began to show cracks due to the ambitions of the Golden Blood. Subutai watched as Princes Guyuk and Buri openly despised Batu, the formal head of the campaign. The old general realized, if this pack of young lions tore at each other's throats, the empire would collapse before reaching the Volga. He became the invisible backbone of the vast army, the man who made every decision but left all the glory to others. When, at one of the feasts, Guyuk openly insulted Batu, putting the campaign at risk of failure, Subutai did not threaten with weapons. He acted colder and wiser. He reminded the princes that their greatness was merely a shadow of their grandfather, and without unity, they would be easy prey for the nations that he, Subutai, had already defeated single-handedly. The general used his authority as a shield, extinguishing conflicts before they turned into open massacre. Subutai was loyal not to Batu personally, but to the very idea of a unified empire. He understood that the princes were merely a political billboard necessary for legitimacy, while he himself was the instrument obligated to get the job done. This was the highest tier of management. He made the heirs to the throne believe that the coming victories were their merit, even though every step the army took, thousands of kilometers forward, was dictated exclusively by his calculations. 7 years of preparation and movement. That is a time during which, in those centuries, entire generations of soldiers were replaced. But for Subutai, these years became a continuous struggle to preserve Genghis Khan's legacy in the hands of his negligent grandsons. By 1241, when the Mongol Tumans emerged at the borders of Europe, the old general finally achieved his goal. The army worked as a single organism. Now the world was about to see a war involving not solitary knights, but a flawlessly coordinated machine of death. Having tamed the ambitions of the princes, Subutai led his Tumans to the borders of the Kingdom of Hungary. Before him lay Europe, confident in its superiority and protected by powerful fortresses and heavy cavalry. But for the old strategist, European armies were nothing more than an obsolete mechanism stuck in the past. He saw that kings of the West relied on valor and stone walls, completely misunderstanding the essence of maneuver warfare. He needed a decisive blow that would not simply crush the Hungarian army, but paralyze the will of all Europe. However, the Sajo River stood in the Mongols' path, turning into a natural line of defense. A deficit of maneuvering space and the fortified Hungarian camp created a situation where any frontal attack would turn into a catastrophe. And then Subutai made a decision that forever entered tactical textbooks. He decided to use something Europeans had never seen on the battlefield: siege engines as mobile artillery. This was his final symphony of destruction. While the princes awaited the signal to attack, the old commander prepared a trap that in a single night would turn the proud Hungarian host into a panic-stricken stampede all the way to Vienna. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol avalanche crashed down upon the Kingdom of Hungary, one of the most powerful bastions of the Christian world. King Bela IV gathered the flower of European warriorhood under his banners, heavy cavalry encased in steel. The Hungarians were confident that the swollen Sajo River would become an insurmountable barrier. They assumed it was enough to hold the single bridge to turn the bank into a graveyard for the Mongols. However, Subutai saw before him not heroes, but hostages of their own pride and outdated tactics. While the Hungarian knights waited for a classic assault, the old general was preparing something Europe had never seen. The reality was that Subutai transformed engineering thought into striking power. If the Hungarians considered the bridge their main protection, Subutai made it their main vulnerability. On that cold April night, the banks of the Sajo were lit up by flashes that the Europeans mistook for sorcery. Subutai ordered heavy stone-throwing machines to be rolled up to the river. This was the birth of field artillery. The Mongols used siege weapons not to destroy walls, but to clear the opposite bank of defenders with a hail of stones and fire. Under this cover, Batu began the attack on the bridge, but this was merely a distraction. The real blow was delivered where no one expected it. While the battle for the bridge boiled in the center, the general's main corps crossed the icy river at a ford downstream under the cover of darkness. When, at dawn, the Hungarian army realized they were being flanked, it was already too late. Subutai began to methodically tighten the ring, using smoke screens to separate enemy units and blind their vision. Subutai understood that Europe's heavy cavalry was invincible in an open field, but helpless in a situation of chaos and lack of space. He turned King Bela IV's camp into a trap. When the Mongols intentionally left a narrow gap in their encirclement, the Hungarians rushed into it. But this was not a path to salvation. It was a corridor of death, several kilometers long, where Mongol archers gunned down the fleeing men like targets. The Battle of Mohi ended with the total annihilation of the Hungarian army. Tens of thousands of warriors were left lying in the mud, and King Bela IV barely escaped with his life. In a single day, Subutai stripped Central Europe of organized defense. The road to Vienna, Paris, and Rome was open. The old commander proved discipline, engineering calculation, and the ability to manage information are worth more than thousands of tons of knightly steel. The victory at Mohi placed Europe on the verge of extinction. Mongol patrols could already see the spires of Austrian cathedrals, and panic in the Vatican reached such a pitch that the faithful seriously awaited the end of the world. The old commander held all the cards. His army was invincible and his enemies demoralized. It seemed nothing could stop him from watering his horses in the Atlantic Ocean. But precisely at the moment of absolute triumph, fate dealt Subutai a blow he could not calculate. From distant Karakorum came news that stopped time. The great Khan Ogadai was dead. According to the Yasa, all princes of the blood had to return immediately for the Kurultai. The campaign of a lifetime, the fruit of decades of planning, had to be aborted on the very threshold of the finale. And then Subutai faced the bitterest choice of his career. He could disobey and continue the conquest of the world, becoming the greatest rebel in history. But he chose loyalty, the very loyalty that had once led him, a blacksmith's son, to the peaks of power. This was his last great maneuver, the Great Retreat, which marked the end of the Mongol dream of world domination. The old commander withdrew to the east, knowing he would never see these lands again. But before disappearing into the shadow of history, he had to perform a final act of wisdom that would allow his legacy to live forever. Many believe that Europe was saved only by the sudden death of Great Khan Ogadai in distant Karakorum, and indeed it was the perfect plot twist, forcing the princes of blood to return home. But modern data reveals a more complex reality. Subutai faced an enemy he could not calculate. The climate. An anomalously rainy spring in 1242 turned the Hungarian steppes into a swamp, and the stone fortresses of the Adriatic did not yield to steppe logic. The Khan's death became simply a flawless political pretext to leave without admitting that even the greatest war machine had begun to stall in the European mud. In 1242, the greatest military campaign in human history was interrupted at its very peak. Subutai, standing one step away from conquering Vienna, turned his tumens around and began the long journey home to the Mongol steppes. For many warriors, this seemed like a defeat, but for the old general, it became the final act of absolute fidelity to the law of the Yasa.
Subutai believed that after returning, he would find peace in the silence of his native forests. However, reality was different. The empire began to slowly rot due to the intrigues of the heirs. The old commander, blind in one eye and exhausted by decades of ceaseless campaigning, proved to be the only authority capable of keeping the princes from internecine strife. He was carried in a special wagon, as he was too heavy for a saddle, but even in this state, he inspired more fear than entire armies of enemies. Subutai spent the last years of his life in his yurt on the banks of the Tool River. He renounced palaces and gold, choosing the life of a simple nomad, as it was before the beginning of the great conquests. The blacksmith's son who reforged the world returned to his origins. He died in 1248 at the age of 73, an age reached by only a few in that era. Let's dissect the scale of his legacy. Subutai left behind not just mountains of skulls, but a new philosophy of war. He was the first to understand that victory is forged thousands of kilometers from the battlefield, in headquarters, through reconnaissance and logistics. His concept of deep operations, where an army splits up to encircle an entire country, was 7 centuries ahead of its time. 73 years of life. In that time, Subutai traveled the path from a boy afraid of horses to a strategist whose actions are studied in modern general staffs in 2025. He left no memoirs, but his handwriting is visible in every border on the modern map of Eurasia. Subutai's story ended to the quiet lapping of a steppe river, but the echo of his campaigns still resonates in the very structure of our world. Subutai traveled the path from an obscure blacksmith's son to the architect of the greatest continental empire, winning 65 pitched battles and never suffering a single defeat. He dismantled the old world using mathematics and iron discipline, leaving behind 32 conquered states. But here is the paradox. Possessing power capable of crushing kings, he remained a simple servant of an idea until his last breath, refusing the throne for the sake of loyalty to the law. Because history is driven not only by the ambitions of rulers, but by the cold calculation of those who stand in their shadow. And this truth, born in the dust of the 13th century Mongol conquests, remains the foundation of grand politics even in our day. But this was only the first of the great dogs of war who created the empire's greatness. A true legend capable of rivaling Subutai in audacity arrived later, a man who began his path as Genghis Khan's bitterest enemy. He was the complete opposite of the calculating strategist. His style was not mathematics, but pure, unrestrained valor and marksmanship that became legendary. His name was Jabe, and his story is the tale of how a single arrow fired at a future emperor changed the fate of the world. And what he did next, becoming the Khan's right hand, the world remembers to this day. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of the cycle. Like if the scale of Subutai's victories amazed you. And write in the comments, do you think Subutai could have conquered all of Europe if not for the death of Ogedei? Thank you for being with us. See you soon.